Greece, Europe. The time, 1,000 years ago, between the 8th and 15th century. Conventionally, we're told that the Europe of these Middle Ages was a time of so-called feudalism. In this video, we'll take a couple different perspectives to suss out an idea we think is very close to the truth. Conventional explanations. A king runs a country. There is stability, a sense of order. A humble peasantry are at the bottom. Above them is the church, the knights, the royal bloodlines, divided by the land holdings, or fiefs, they originate from. All take solace in their faith. The nobility protect the peasants, and the peasants have hard, miserable lives in the mud and are ignorant and sad with no rights. But this is a projection. It is a generalization at best, and self-deception at least. Let's chip away at this conventional idea by turning to Susan Reynolds, author of Fiefs and Vassals. The idea of feudalism as a system was made in hindsight to grant legitimacy to the real power of the land and office holders, which had continuously grown in wealth and power. They were even able to introduce their own legal structure. By the 16th century, legal scholars were calling the political system feudalism. In a sense, they made a strict and inflexible ism out of a highly varied and diverse social world. The relationships between the nobility was the center aspect of this world, but it was one social structure among others. Also, it was a definition invented in hindsight to place a legal veneer on the warriors who had used violence to extort society. Let's acknowledge some realities about this feudalism. It exists in a post-prophet world within a dominant Christianity. The depths of the Middle Ages were the height of ideological culture. It was a time of radical collectivism where material issues were seen as dishonest and unreal. Individuality was buried under the zenith of religious fervor. There was a development or refinement of slavery, a serfdom rather than classical slavery. Serfdom meant a tying to land owned by landowners, and all the products of the land going to him, with no freedom of movement. There was friction between the nobility and the collective churches led by the bishops. The nobility sought to further sink its teeth into the rural people, and the church stopped the worst excesses of this. Right out of the gate, let's work out some definitions of the major players during this period. Who is the peasantry? The peasantry are the communities of free farmers who lived in independent villages. While generally Christian, they retain many aspects of pagan spirituality. They will be attacked as the influence of the nobility grows and subjected to serfdom, a development of slavery. They represent a diminished form of organic society, and their way of life is generally democratic and egalitarian. Who is in the cities? The cities are populated by craftsmen, traders, and the unemployed. They are generally cosmopolitan and communal. They are typically free of the burden of exploitation, capable of self-defense, and are managed generally by council or alderman-type institutions. There is friction between the wealthy polities of the cities and the growing power of the state under the various monarchies. Who is the church? The Christian churches exist in a hierarchy under Rome. For now. They are central to community and the hub for collectivism at this time. Many religious heresies developed against the church in bids to increase the freedom of people or adapt to local conditions. The independent monasteries are where art, science, and philosophy are developed during this period. The churches used political action to stop the worst excesses of peasant exploitation, but would recognize the warrior nobility as legitimate rulers. Who is the nobility? The nobility are people who declare themselves to be nobles or swear oaths to their peers. There is a bigger difference between peasants and serfs than between peasants and nobles. They could be granted the lucrative responsibility of landholding, law judging, or organizing warriors into armies. Their position comes from leading or being part of influential families, which are evolutions of the tribal form. They enlarge their wealth and power by forcing themselves like vampires on the peasants, demanding taxes and routines of free labor. They would demand themselves special rights as their system of power grew during the Middle Ages. So, this feudalism, is a term of describing the relationships between the nobility explicitly. This is a very limited outlook. One reason why feudalism fails so hard as a social explanation is that it does not provide for the horizontal political relationships that existed at the time and the negotiated status of the peasants in free cities. It imagines the warriors as the only legal reality, which made sense, seeing as how these warriors would cement their position to become the system of European politics. Now we can understand why this term feudalism was made in hindsight. It was dolled up, essentially, to conceal its emptiness. Feudalism was legitimizing the violent and amateurish domination of Europe by the available methods, a nobility of petty warriors who clothed themselves as emperors, and their oppression and theft from the various ethnic groups of peasants who lived on the land.
For a concrete example, let's tell a story about a local nobility, the peculiar origins of the Count of Barcelona. The first Count of Barcelona was appointed by the Carolingian Franks. The Carolingian Franks fused the tribal oath tradition with the Roman obsession with power, emperors, and law. So already that's a clue about feudalism right there. What is a count? A count is a title of nobility. In this case, a conferred position of commander or judge. We'd be wise to remember that nobility has no special essence, but reflects a status which could be assumed by really anybody. What makes them feudal is that they swore oaths to other powerful warriors or kings, thus becoming part of the vertical feudal system. As the nobility entrenched itself over the Middle Ages, they claimed more privileges, but lost real political power due to centralization. The first count, Bera I, was appointed as such by Louis the Pious. When Louis besieged Barcelona, then under control of the Muslim emir of Cordoba, Louis looked around, saw Bera, who had served him in the siege with his father, and appointed him to govern the city under oath to him. So Bera now had the privilege to dispense justice and command forces. Boom! A count. Funnily enough, the reason Louis took an army to Barcelona in the first place was that the Andalusian politician Sadun al-Rouhani asked for aid from the Franks in a power struggle against the emir who had appointed him years earlier. By the time the Franks arrived, Sadun al-Rouhani had reconciled with the emir and refused the Frankish army, so they just besieged the city, taking it. History is rife with goofy incidents like this. Anyways, Bera is a bit of a pacifist and asks to make peace with the emir, but is bound by the oath of loyalty he made to the Franks and marches his routine of warriors all up and down the coast, attacking Tortosa on a series of puny expeditions. In the year 812, he is recalled to the court where local nobles from his own lands were complaining he was taxing them too heavily. Years later, in 820, Bera was accused of infidelity and treason for wanting to preserve a truce with the Muslims and had to settle the accusation in a duel on horseback with javelins against the Goth Sanila. Bera lost, being fairly old at this point. Following his logic of now being guilty of treason, he was sentenced to death, which was commuted to banishment. And Bera, the very first Count of Barcelona, lived out the rest of his life in Rouen, in Normandy, where he died in the year 844. Louis the Pious needed a new count in the city of Barcelona and chose Rampeau to take the oath. Rampeau had been a loyal servant of Carlemagne and been tasked with informing Louis of the old king's death. He would now administer justice and the troops of the city. And administer he did. By which I mean he immediately assembled soldiers to go pillaging land south of the city. Thus is a slice of life in the origins of the feudal arrangements, of oaths and warriors fighting and dying over basically nothing, while society continues to grow and evolve underneath almost unacknowledged by the official history.
The cliques of nobility, the tribe, family, dynasty, were constantly infighting to increase their share of the monopoly spoils. Their claims would define and draw the borders that cut Europe into pieces. The nobility came from the warrior culture, but was also rife with impostors. Men swore oaths to each other and were internally recognized as possessing the land, and entitled to extort the people's villages who worked on it. They lived off the revenue the peasants produced. The boundary of the king's domain extended only as far as those who swore oaths to him on the ground. The real power came from violence, which relies on local men, and force of arms organized by those who swear the oath. But these warrior cliques have existed throughout history, and across the world, not only in Europe, wherever warriors have been unrestrained. In this sense, it is not unique. They create their own system of politics. If the professional violence of the warriors had been suborned to the political entities of the free cities or peasants' confederations, history would have turned out much differently. Instead, we have a collaboration of warriors, wise elders, and priestly ideology. Historically, this is what we can refer to as the state, an elaboration of the ziggurat structure, essentially a flexible organ of domination and expropriation that has both the skill of violence and the intellectual cleverness to assert itself, mask itself as natural and normal, and live a separate, subsidized existence from the so-called bottom of society. The feudalism reflects something deeper than itself. It is a mutation born of the war and power clique. So its formation draws from many different sources, encouraged to find stability to exploit wealth, internal and external war, and grow power through law and contracts. So feudalism is one mutation of a deeper thing, and the European Middle Age example came into being because it was able to. What is the war and power clique? The war and power clique is the antagonist of democratic life and the opponent of democratic society. It has grown consistently throughout history and usually appears as warrior, elite classes, nobility, opportunists and entrepreneurs, and high priests. Examples might be the Roman Senate, the French court at Versailles, the Bank of London, or modern-day Davos, which is a spicy example, but accurate. They all share an anti-democratic mindset and are only adept at pursuing power. Power and war are the fundamental passion, mind, and will of this tradition. It remains at odds with society. It exists only to abuse and exploit society towards its own enrichment, and also depends on disguising itself as a natural order. This consequently means that their leadership is inherently unstable. Eventually, unless the exploitable wealth continues to grow, they will kill the goose that lays the golden eggs, as we will see. The feudal system versus society. When we reflect that the stem cell of society is communal in nature and able to express itself in terms of politics and morality, it's clear that the natural society is the peasantry and the citizens of the urban cities. These are also the productive groups of society, who grow food to sustain their communities and furnish crafts within guild organizations. With this view, we can also see that the so-called feudalism is also rather marginal. The kings and nobility were a warrior class, but we should not identify society with the violent armies who were always usurpers. They lived, in a sense, off to the side, literally hidden in their fortress castles. The spheres of life were in the cities and in the villages. In these places there was no king, scarcely a nobility, so how can we identify it as feudal? It is outside the feudal system. In these places there were systems of relative democracy. There were peasants' unions, collective churches, and people identified themselves with their communities. However, this society became burdened with supporting that nobility. Without the natural peasant and city society, there could be no nobility, no warrior class. There is no parasite without a living host. Over time, the warrior classes would organize themselves and expand their own rights and power. This would result in very strong feudal aspects, such as contracts and inheritances, and expansion of the serfdom, a form of slavery, as we mentioned. There is a problem with our historical points of reference, that we look at the kings and nobility and generals as the figures, heroes, and identify history with them, because our own modern time state is unfortunately descended from that domain. A blindness to social reality is the result. The focus of historical knowledge has been on obscure dates, the movement of warrior soldiers, and the descent lineage of appropriators. But viewed as they are, as simple warriors, their development has no value except to perpetuate destruction. World Systems Perspective. In fact, from 1300 into the 1500s, there was an explosion of peasant revolts that destabilized the feudal system. Or were the uprisings a response to a decline in that feudal system? We've talked a lot about ideas, but let's make a short material analysis from a world systems perspective. Feudalism was more than a ghost. It was a real system, a tribute structure, that existed to support the upper class of nobility which had vague origins. Likewise, the wealth base, the serfs and peasants, would become further encumbered. The strength of these systems is the accumulation of wealth and power. Its life lay in the fact that it could guarantee economic flows from the periphery to the core, the cities, the castles, the royal coffers, the official ledger. By force of taxation and tribute, and by monopoly on trade. Its weakness lay in the fact that the political centralization that enabled this tends to absorb too much of the profit. The bureaucracy, the aristocracy, especially as repression and revolt paradoxically increased military expenditure. This is the trap, and the basic rubric behind the collapse of every major empire, from China to Persia to Rome to feudal, and the modern times likewise. This feudal system reached its high point during the 1200s. This was due to the climate and the warm period of this century, which produced an era that tended towards relative plenty. A system based on agriculture was seeing more production than ever. This was felt in a large expansion of wealth. Frontiers were cultivated. The Crusades provided a sort of colonial booty. But over the next 200 years, as the warm climate waned into a small ice age during the 1400s, the upper strata was unwilling to give up their share of the profits, as the total wealth pie shrunk dramatically. System crisis. The feudal system entered its terminal crisis in that century. Cultivated areas retracted, population declined, demand for agriculture contracted, wars started as the states fought to increase their income in a poorer world. Heavy war taxes and war economies caused a liquidity crisis, reducing tax pools further, and a downward spiral started as consumption slowed, production slowed to match it, less money circulated which upset international trade, and borrowing increased as royal treasuries ran dry. A credit crisis exploded, prices rose, and peasants fled the manorial economy. And of course, peasant rebellions went with economic recession, as they promised the cleansing fire of a new social order. The society was paralyzed, and collapse was the only outcome. The one thing that might have avoided the disintegration was a total growth of the economic pie, which did not occur. The share of profits could no longer support the ever-growing cost of the political and military superstructure that controlled the flow of money from the lower stratas. In all honesty, this was a accumulation of 1,000 years of development since the collapse of the Roman system in 400 AD. The death of the seigneurial manor economy came at an interesting time. From a world systems perspective, the capitalist economy was born during the 1500s, during the destabilization of that division of labor, and the import of gold and silver from the New World colonies. It was the fragile state of the old system that allowed a new system to begin in earnest. The crisis of feudalism was an opportunity for a novel, more flexible order.
Remenka Union. Let's have another story. This time, the opposite pole from the domination war power elites. This one is about the efforts of democratic society. The conquests and reconquests of the Iberian Peninsula between the Islamic and Catholic armies meant that the consolidation of the warriors' power over the people was very weak. In Old Catalonia, which had remained in the hands of the Catholic nobility, there was significant exploitation of the peasant farmers, who had to pay redemption to the nobility to leave their farms. In the New Catalonia, the new conquests by the Catholics, the nobility had previously fled the approaching Islamic armies, and the peasants were much more free, having autonomous self-governance in the villages and very few class divisions. When the emirate had been defeated, the Catalan elites could safely turn their violence inwards and increase the abuse of the peasantry. They consolidated their power and introduced new obligations the peasants had to accept, the Lus Malik Trantandi, the bad uses. It was the introduction of the dreaded serfdom. It penalized farmers who didn't make a will, introduced a penalty payment to the lord if a farmer died without offspring, revoking of women's property if they committed adultery, and obligations to only use their landlord's infrastructure, mills, and metal shops, an economic monopoly. For these and other abuses, the peasant rioted and revolted in 2 wars of protest, seizing castles from the warrior nobility and forcing an arbitration between the peasant unions and the King of Aragon. The legacy of these actions is that the peasantry of Catalonia fought a successful war for their own liberation and defeated the legalized abuses. Famously, it produced a historical document, the Book of the Remenka Union, where the serfs themselves architected their freedom and chose representatives from their various Catholic diocese parishes. 10,500 people attended these assembly meetings. It would be by these meetings that an organizational sinew was formed, and when the second remensa was declared at the right opportunity and successfully waged, it triggered the negotiated abolition of serfdom. This is a fantastic example of society's self-defense armies fighting a successful war for liberation.
The transformation of power. In Europe, over the course of the Middle Centuries, an enormous amount of power had been accumulated by the nobility, its king, the head of this class of nobles. The state of England, we know, evolved out of the literal routine of the king and his court, and a bureaucracy to manage his affairs, so we can see the continuation of power from feudal privilege to modern state. During the French Revolution, we're accustomed to thinking that the king's power was gone with his head, but instead, that power, the monopoly of control, was preserved with the new revolutionary government. The power was not abolished, it was appropriated. So instead of a floating nobility, you have a new, state-affiliated counter-society, the bourgeoisie. These opportunists and experts in money would join the wise men, priestly ideologues, and warriors. The mutation called feudalism is dead, but the war and power clique that undergirds the order has merely transformed into a more stable form.